Okay, welcome everyone. I was just mentioning to everyone here, years ago when I would do a Bible study, it was all women, and today we have all men. So without further ado, let us begin with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for calling us together once again as we continue our sacred journey into the scriptures. We know that you are waiting for us and ready to bless us with wisdom and understanding that we need for the living of these days. So we open our hearts and our minds and ask that you prepare us that we might receive your truth and go forth to live it. For we ask it through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. All righty. So we have some wisdom that Jesus passed along to his followers. And it's basically, what do you do when you're not seeing eye to eye with someone? And this definitely got my attention when I look at just the animosity that is everywhere these days. You know, people definitely do not see eye to eye on a lot of things. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it's how we handle those situations when we're not seeing eye to eye. So without further ado, I just realized I didn't cue it up. I thought it began at the beginning of the
temptations to sin.
Okay.
For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish.
Okay, here we are.
If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. There.
All right. So the first part obviously wasn't part of the lectionary reading for Sunday. It is also a prime example where you cannot always take everything that Jesus says or every word of Scripture literally. Jesus does not expect you to cut your hand off or pluck your eye out. He's using hyperbole to make a point.
Well, that's a relief.
Yes, that's a relief. Yes, so this passage, by the way, gives you a good example of how Scripture evolves. So let me ask you this question. Did Jesus intend to start a church?
No.
He intended to start a movement. And he certainly encouraged his followers to go and share the good news. But church, which in the Greek, which the New Testament was written in, the word would have been ecclesia. And so later translators, writing from the perspective of an established church, put that word in there. I think it would be better to say community of faith or followers. Okay, so having said that, what do you make of what Jesus is saying here?
17 puts a lot of things in there.
If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he also refuses to listen to even the church, let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Have nothing to do with them.
That leaves us out.
How so?
Because I was Gentiles.
Oh, we're Gentiles. Yes,
Yeah.
that's of course we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what Jesus is saying here is if someone has done something inappropriate, you go to the person and you talk to him or her. If the person won't listen, you get a couple of others in the community of faith to go and speak to the person. And if that person still won't listen, you have nothing to do with them. Does that seem very Christian?
No.
No? Okay. Why not?
It creates an assumption
What's the assumption?
that you're right and they're wrong.
You know, it's interesting. I wrote in my notes here that once you open that door, you have to understand that it swings both ways. And the two witnesses can be there to validate what happened, but they can also protect the accused. Okay? They can protect the accused by basically saying to the accuser, you know what, we've listened to everything that you've had to say here, and you know what, you're wrong. You're wrong. Yeah, hi, Jane. So, you know, we look at this and so the question that I have is, what Jesus is saying here, does it only apply to a community of faith?
Applies everyday.
Everyday living.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. I think the one thing we can say here is that what Jesus is saying is it applies to you if you want to be his faithful follower. And that can be with a relationship with someone in the church or in your day-to-day life. If you want to be a faithful follower of him, this is what you do. Get another. There we go. Thank you, Max.
What does it mean to be loose on earth and loose in heaven?
So basically, what Jesus is saying here, and this is a passage that is very applicable to the Catholic Church.
Yes, that's right. It gives the authority of the Pope.
Mhm. So elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, after the Great Confession, where Jesus says to the disciples, who do you say that I am? And they say, well, some people say you're, excuse me, a prophet, and others are saying that you're John the Baptist and this and that. And then Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? The eternal question that each of us has to answer for ourselves. Who do you say that I am? And then Peter, in a moment of fervor, divine revelation, says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is the first time that Jesus acknowledges that he is the Messiah. And by the way, Christ is simply the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. And Messiah means anointed one. So when Peter says, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. This is the first time that Jesus acknowledges that what people have been wondering is true. He is the Messiah. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the fact that Jesus goes through really the 2 years, 9 months of his ministry before acknowledging that he's the Messiah is known as the Messianic secret. And that confuses people because the thought is, well, why doesn't he want everyone to know? Isn't that why he came? Go ahead, Don.
The Romans.
Right, the Romans. Because what we have to do is we have to put this whole understanding or desire for a Messiah in the context of what was going on then. What we know is that the Jews were living under Roman rule and they were deeply oppressed. And so when they started talking about Messiah, they were looking for a conquering hero, a political leader who would get rid of the Romans and establish the kingdom of David, their father. And Jesus knew that if he let it be known that he was the Messiah, all of this nationalistic fervor would come bubbling up. People would be inspired to take up arms. He would have been arrested and he would have been crucified even before his ministry started. So that's why he kind of plays this game. He puts tantalizing clues out there, but not until Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus knows at this point, I'm on my way to Jerusalem. I'm on my way for the final act of this sacred drama. And so at this point, it's okay. Yes, you can know that I am the Messiah. And so Jesus then, after he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah," he then says, "Truly I tell you, you are a rock." And what is the Greek word for rock? Petra. Peter. Peter literally means rock in Greek. So, for example, if you become so frightened that you can't move, you're said to be what? Petrified. You become like stone. Okay. If a tree falls in the forest and water with a high iron content enters into that fallen tree, it becomes what kind of wood? Petrified. Okay. Petra. It's rock. And so Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, you are a rock. And upon this rock I will build my church." Once again, Jesus didn't know what the word church was. But he says, "You are a rock, and upon this rock I will build my community of faith. And truly I tell you, whatever you bound on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And what that means in the eyes of the Catholic Church is that at that moment, Jesus gave Peter the keys to the kingdom. And so that is why in the Catholic Church, the belief is that the priest has the power to absolve sins. Okay, basically take them off your heavenly report card, so to speak. And so that's what he's saying here. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.
Whatever sins are released from you on earth
Will be released in heaven. Yeah. Now, Protestants came along and said, no. The only mediator we have between God and us is Jesus. And so the Protestant reformers did away with the confession. Well, not confession, but the power of an individual to forgive.
Those plenary indulgences.
Yes.
Which, had that, and then when you got the little document, it had that as a footnote.
Yeah.
That referred to.
Now-
95 and boxed up, and you're in here.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's-
Now, I will say that it's known as the priestly role, okay? The priestly role is being a mediator between God and humans. And so ministry includes the prophetic voice, where you declare God's will, thus says the Lord. It includes the priestly role in the Catholic Church and the pastoral role, caring, tending for the sheep. I actually believe that our Protestant reformers made a mistake when they did away with the priestly role in ministry. And I had an experience when I was in seminary where a man was dying and was terrified. And by the grace of God, I began to realize that he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of what was waiting for him after death. And so he gave me a deathbed confession. And it wasn't me that was speaking, it was the Spirit. I absolutely know that, because when you're in seminary, you're supposed to be the problem solver, the miracle worker, the person who can walk on water. And I hadn't a clue what to do. And essentially, what I did was I pronounced forgiveness. And he died a couple of days later. In fact, the next day when I went to see him, I asked him, yesterday you were frightened. How are you feeling today? He says, I'm okay now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm at peace. And see, if I'd been the good Protestant in that instance and said, well, let's pray and ask God to forgive you, do you think it would have worked? Yeah. But here's the difference between the Catholic understanding of the priestly role and what I coin a Protestant understanding of the priestly role. The priestly role in the Catholic Church is, and I'm simplifying here, but it's basically I have the keys to the kingdom. And so when I jingle the keys, you jump and you do the penance that I give you, and then I'll forgive you. That makes it all about the priest. What I say is that our job as ordained clergy is to empty ourselves of our pride, our vulnerabilities and everything, so that we can be a channel, an instrument of that grace, which is what happened in that hospital room, where literally the Spirit took over, because what came out of my mouth didn't come from me. Because, when he finally said, I'm frightened, what I said was, I know you're frightened, and I'm frightened too, because I want to help you and I don't know how. And at that moment, that's when the confession, and it literally was a deathbed confession. So here's an example of how the community of faith is supposed to work. What we have here is, what do you do when the community of faith isn't working, when relationships aren't working? And what I will say is, what Jesus is saying here, specifically in terms of relationships with people in a community of faith, also applies to relationships in general. Do you ever have a situation where you didn't see eye to eye with someone? I think anybody who says, oh, I've never had that experience, is either clueless or lying. Okay. And so what do you do as a person of faith in those situations? Yeah. Go ahead, Andy.
I can just say personal experience. I've gone two different routes.
Two different routes, okay?
Whatever it is that the differences between us,
Mm-hmm.
in most cases, I just don't bring it up anymore.
Okay.
Because my good, if they're such good friends, I have plenty else to talk about.
Okay.
That we can still be friends without discussing what bothers us.
Mm-hmm. Now, can I ask a clarifying question? In that situation, are you talking about something the person did that upset you, or just a belief that upset you?
Sometimes the answer is both.
Yep. Both.
With the political differences we're going through now, most of the time it's political differences.
Yep.
But no, I know there have been times where somebody has done something that I just would never have done, and
Mm-hmm.
I can't, whatever the word is, I can't forgive, or I can't let go.
Mm-hmm.
And but I can put that. I don't talk about it anymore, but I'm still friends for the
Okay.
other things.
Yep. So let me ask you this question. Let's kind of come at it from the other side. In our society, when you're not seeing, or someone's not seeing eye to eye with someone, or is angry, what are the ways they usually react? How do they usually handle it? Avoidance? Lash out? Say again, confrontation? I would say that's the big one, confrontation. And I've started writing the sermon, and I said very early on, it isn't that we just disagree. We're at the point where the attitude seems to be, if you don't agree with me 100%, you are my enemy. That's the attitude we have these days. And it boggles my mind.
That you're either with us or against us.
Yeah, although Jesus said just the opposite. Remember what happened when the disciples came back and said, Lord, we saw a man, who's not one of us. He was casting out demons in your name, and we forbid him. And what did Jesus say?
Don't do that.
He said, leave him alone. He said, those who aren't against us are with us. The exact opposite of what we're seeing today. So that's confrontation. That is and not only verbal confrontation, but violent confrontation.
Murders.
Murders, yeah.
A road rage.
A road rage?
All the examples of road rage.
That's a good example.
What's that?
No, road rage is a good example.
Yeah.
Yep. So what I see in what Jesus is telling us to do is just the opposite of what we're seeing. In everything that Jesus is saying here, there's one common denominator. There's a thread going through this whole passage. And once again, he may be specifically talking about the community of faith, but what he's saying is also true for day-to-day life in the so-called real world. There is a common thread in this. What is it?
You did a sermon on this a number of years ago that I never forgot.
What was that?
The term of it was how to disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah,
And that is the exact thing you're talking
yeah,
about here too.
exactly. It is possible to disagree without being disagreeable. But we've lost that. What we have today instead is what I would call an intolerable intolerance. That's what we have today. And that's a tongue twister, an intolerable intolerance.
That's not true, I'm not.
So, but again, there is a common thread through this. One of the other things that I've said, and I think it does apply here today in this passage, is I firmly believe, and I think Jesus would agree, that it is always more important to love than to be right. And see, that's what we have in our society. I can only love you if you agree that I'm right. Okay? Love has nothing to do with being right or wrong. Love has to do with tolerance and respect. And by the way, I'll just throw this in again as another aside. One of the things that drives me crazy is this thought that tolerance means you have to dumb everything down to the lowest common denominator. Okay, so you can't talk about things that you disagree with. It's one of the reasons why, there's the big to-do raises its head every now and then when the Chamber of Commerce has its tree lighting. They call it a holiday tree. Can't call it a Christmas tree because that might offend someone, And my counter argument is, okay, so does that mean, and actually they did this last year, they've done it the last few years, they've had a menorah on the common, okay? So if we can't call a Christmas tree, we have to call it a holiday tree. Does that mean that we have to call the menorah a candelabra? Because that might offend someone? See, that's the dumbing down to the lowest common denominator. That's not what tolerance is all about. Tolerance is, I let you be fully who you are, and you let me be fully who I am. And we talk to each other, and we learn from each other, and we grow with each other. And dumbing down to the lowest common denominator. So what that means is, if say it's early December and I'm in Walmart and I go through the line and the cashier finishes everything up, and as I'm leaving, I'm saying, Merry Christmas, okay? And that cashier doesn't get offended by that. And the cashier responds by saying to me, Happy Hanukkah. It's possible that the cashier might be Jewish, you know. I wouldn't have a problem with that. I also don't have a problem if somebody wants to say Happy Holidays to me. That's fine. But don't tell me I can't say Merry Christmas. That is dumbing things down. That's not what tolerance is all about. Okay. So again, there's a situation where I'm not seeing eye to eye.
You made a comment on tolerance that I think is an important one. We can't grow unless we have tolerance. And one of
True.
the problems as individuals growing today is, and a lot of the angst and fighting is a very immature level because we don't have tolerance enough to grow immature.
Well, that lack of tolerance is an insecurity.
Yeah.
Okay. I cannot be right unless all of you are wrong. That's an insecurity. So let me throw this out there. Where does the solution to all of this lie? It's one word. It is a 3-letter word. And I'll amend what I was going to say. Obviously, it starts with God. Okay. But when you take God seriously, when you take your faith seriously, then the solution to all of this conflict leads you to another 3-letter word. All of a sudden, I'm thinking we should play hangman. Hangman. Look, that 3-letter word isn't in here, but a 4-letter variation of it is in here. Oh, no, it isn't here.
Two?
No, it's 3 letters.
No, I mean.
Oh, T-O-O?
Like T-W-O.
Oh, 2. Nope. Nope.
People have to.
Okay, I'm doing some quick arithmetic here.
You.
That's it.
Okay.
You. Look how many times the word you or your appears in there. If your brother sins against you, you go and tell him. Let me see. Truly I say to you, again I say to you, what I see in here is everything comes back to you, okay? And that's not how people,
No, it isn't.
when there's a conflict,
Yeah.
why should I have to go to that person?
Yeah.
They're wrong, they should come to me. When they come and they admit that they're wrong, then I'll talk to them, okay? What Jesus is saying is the responsibility as a person of faith is on you.
Eventually, nearly all spiritual paths will say, you've cracked the nut once you realize everything you see is your responsibility.
That's right. That's right. It starts with you. You know, and that's not the way people do it. They'll fuss and they'll fume. They'll talk to others. You say, you know what that jerk did the other day? Okay. Or, you know what? I'm not going to have anything to do with that person until they admit they're wrong and they apologize to me. Okay. Yes, Don.
Now, I have a question.
Okay.
My question goes like this. He starts out saying, supposing you have a personal transgression that you have to thrash out with somebody else. And go to them. Don't fester about
Right.
this.
You go to them.
Don't case against them. You go to them and you say, you know what you did? You know what you did that really honked me off? And
Yep.
you knew you were doing it. That's the responsible adult thing to do with anybody. That's step one. And then Jesus goes another step further, and he says, as you said, get 2 of your brethren to come and see, and come sit in judgment who is invalidate or disqualify.
Yeah, but that 2 or 3 go with you. As I say, that door swings both ways.
And I
Okay.
don't understand what he means about the church. Matthew was imagining a church that didn't exist.
Correct.
But right at the end of the thing about church, he says, let me see if I can find it again.
Sure.
All right. The church agrees with you that he's a jerk. treat him as if he were a Gentile or a tax collector, which is basically, they are now anathema.
Yep.
Almost like a leper,
Mhm,
except you have to give them money if they say it's tax day.
mhm,
So I guess what I'm saying is there are two messages going on here. It's heavenly when we agree,
mhm.
but he says apparently that you're entitled to simply disqualify.
Or maybe what he's saying is, sometimes what you need is tough love. Okay. Paul says something very similar. And he says that if a person will not take responsibility, give them over to Satan. Now, I've always looked at that as Paul saying, maybe what the person really needs is a shock treatment. Okay. Now, at the other end of this is a realization that we're not all powerful. Okay. And we cannot control other people. Okay. And what Jesus is saying here is you have to be careful, because sometimes if you need to do it because it can be like a cancer. Let me give you an example. When I was the interim pastor in Gray, Maine, there was a major scandal in the year that I was there that involved the church peripherally. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Gray, Maine, but there is a restaurant up there that's sort of like Gray's equivalent of Kitty's. It's called Cole's Restaurant. And a number of Norman Cole's relatives were in the church. And Norman Cole, literally about 3 months before my time there ended and I came to North Reading, was arrested for pedophilia. Sad, shocking. There's a lake just near the center of Gray called Crystal Lake, and there's an island on it. And apparently he had a cabin on there. And he would take kids out to the cabin, get them drunk, and, basically sin. As shocking as that was, what shocked me even more is I remember having a conversation with the organist in the church. She'd been an organist there for many years, and she said, oh yeah, she said, people in town have been talking for years, decades, about Norman and his boys. This was a kind of a open secret.
An open secret, yeah.
Normalized.
Yeah, it was normalized, okay? And so that's what I see Jesus addressing here, is to avoid these situations where, oh, well, what should have happened there is somebody should have blown the whistle on him and taken the drastic measure. And that's what I see Jesus saying here is, sometimes you have to protect yourself.
I'm wondering, when I read this, if he's saying there are personal transgressions, and then we as a corporate group
There's that as
have
well.
an entirely different set of responsibilities.
Mhm.
And we are allowed to shun people, throw them out, and
Mhm.
treat them as nobodies. But
But-
you are obligated by this phrase he has down here, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name.
There I
I
am.
think what he says is if they agree. If
Yeah.
you agree, then
Yeah.
anything you may ask.
Mhm. Yeah,
So he's saying, you can't just take offense.
no.
You have to, you can't take offense.
Sometimes, I forget the name of the pastor, he was pastor of one of these mega churches. And he said, when you have somebody who is acting in a way that they're literally a cancer, okay, to the community. He says you have three options. I'm trying to remember what they are. You can convert them, convict them, or kill them.
And you mustn't kill them.
No, what he meant by that is that you basically say,
Dead to me,
you know,
yeah.
and it doesn't happen often, but there have been a few times over the years where I've had to say to someone, you know, maybe this community of faith isn't the place for you.
Well, I'm thinking about your parish in Gray.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's one thing if a person sitting at the organ knows.
Yep.
It's another if she's spoken to a few people over the years.
Mm.
But if everybody knew, and isn't everybody equally sinful?
Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
at some point, the body, out of self-defense,
Mm-hmm.
is going to have to say, no, we don't agree with it. Now, my disqualifier here is,
Yeah.
you know how much guts it takes
To
walk
do.
down to the police
Oh,
office
yeah.
and say, you know what, I haven't got photographs, I don't know anything,
Mm-hmm.
I just have rumor. The organist told me.
Yeah.
So my heart goes out.
Well, I'll tell you where we see that more and more, and it's actually being used as a weapon. You don't agree with a neighbor, you report, and they have a family, you report them to DCF. You know, you say, well, then, and you can do it anonymously.
I hate that,
I understand.
because that's Germany.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
like
yeah.
Anne Frank.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, what was it? If you can say, look, I'm looking at the children right now,
Mm-hmm,
and they are in tatters
mm-hmm.
and beaten, then you're not really testifying to anything more than you know.
Right,
That I can go along with.
right. Because then it's the responsibility of the authorities to investigate and see if this was just, you know, the mother's sick in
Yeah.
bed and the kids, you know.
But the corporate body has a different kind of responsibility than the human being does.
Yep.
All
Yep.
human beings do, never mind. I'm
You
sorry.
know, it's all, you know, applicable. But again, you know, the thread that I see going through all of this is it's up to you. Okay, you don't see eye to eye. You go and have the heart-to-heart talk. Yes, Max.
So I guess this kind of brings me to, like, you know, let's say, you know, you have to, you know, banish someone from the community, you know, exile them from your community of faith.
Yeah.
The first thing I kind of thought of, I don't understand Star Wars references, is how do you not make a Darth Vader out of that?
How do you make a dog not?
How do you not make a Darth Vader out of that?
Oh, a Darth Vader.
How do you
Oh,
not
interesting.
end up with a problem 10 times worse? You hope that.
Person may come back and shoot everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
okay.
How do you do that? But it not end
Yep.
such a.
Because, and that's a very good question. You know, you take the extreme example or this extreme action, okay? And let's take it out of the context of the community of faith. You basically say, you know, this person is so toxic. Okay, maybe that's a way of looking at it. There are toxic people in this world. Okay, no matter what you do, you cannot get them to see what they're doing is wrong. Okay, it just gave me an example. M. Scott Peck. He's famous for his first book, The Road Less Traveled. He wrote a follow-up book called People of the Lie. And I'm not sure if I go along with him the entire way, but he was a therapist. And therapists have this book called the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And it has all the criteria for making psychological diagnosis, like narcissistic personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder. And M. Scott Peck said that we should include a category of, I forget exactly how he put it, but basically evil personality disorder. And he even goes to the extent where he talks about witnessing an exorcism. Okay, but he pointed out that there are people of the lie. In other words, using your Darth Vader example, they've given themselves over to the dark side. And no matter what you do, you can't reason with them. He tells this story, and I used this in a sermon many years ago, and it upset people. Essentially, it was a few days after Christmas, and Peck got a call from the local police department asking him to come down and do a psychological evaluation of this teenager who had stolen a car, and crashed it. And he's in, juvenile detention, and they're beginning to think he's severely depressed. So Scott Peck starts meeting with him and talking to him. And as I say, it's right after Christmas. So he's trying to make connections with the kid. And so he says, so did you have a good Christmas? Kid says, "No, it's all right." And Peck says, well, you get anything good for Christmas? Not really. He says, well, you must have gotten something. He says, yeah, I got a gun. Now, what I forgot to tell you is that like a year earlier, this kid's older brother had taken a gun and shot himself, committed suicide. And so the kid says, yeah, I got the gun for Christmas. And Peck says, oh, you mean your parents got you a gun? He says, no, I got the gun. Well, as Peck continues to talk to the kid, he finds out that the father, for Christmas, gives the kid the exact same gun that the older brother used to kill himself. Yeah, I see from your face, you're thinking that's
Pretty twisted.
That's pretty screwed up. So Peck meets with the parents, and he says, I understand you gave your son the gun for Christmas. And the father says, yes. And so Peck says, is that really appropriate? And the father says, and this, I forget where it was, but like Western Pennsylvania, where you go out hunting and all of that. And so it's a part of the culture. And the father says, well, he says, what's wrong with that? He said, I had a gun when I was his age. And the father and Peck says, well, don't you understand that by giving this kid the gun that his older brother used to kill himself, it's basically sending a message, why don't you go and do the same thing? And the father said, he said, well, we're not educated and have college degrees like you. And then Peck says, well, did you think about just going out and getting, a different gun, so it would be his gun and totally separate from what had happened? And the father says, well, we don't have a lot of money. And what Peck said was that the father, no matter what he said, the father could not get beyond his blinders. And so, yes, there are some people who are like that. And what Jesus is saying here is, you know what? There are times, you're not all powerful. You can't control others. You can't make others conform. So what you have to do is say,
In God's hands, basically,
Huh?
at that point? At
Say-
that point, you basically say it's in God's hands, it's outside of my control.
God?
Yeah, like. at
No,
that
God
point,
never
you have to
gives,
say-
no. Yeah, God will continue.
You just say it's in his hands. and-
God never gives up on anyone, absolutely. But to answer your question, how do we avoid creating a Darth Vader? Well, the first thing I would say is a person like that is already a Darth Vader. They've sort of given themselves over to this dark side, if you will. What we as people of faith can do is there are different ways of saying, I can't have anything to do with you. Okay. You can go to the person and say, you know what, you are evil. You're evil to the core, and I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I don't know how you can be the person you are and sleep like you do at night. That's one way. Not the way I think Jesus would have us handle it. I think you go and you can say to the person, it really pains me because there's a lot about you that I like, but there are some things that I just don't understand. And, maybe I'm wrong here, but my heart is telling me that I can't be in a relationship with you anymore. Now, that doesn't mean I'm closing the door and locking it and throwing away the key. I hope somehow by the grace of God, maybe somewhere down the road, we can, get to a better place. Jesus would say a woman in an abusive relationship, okay? I knew a colleague, minister once, who said, Jesus, he tells us to follow him, come and follow him. And sometimes he even asks us to die for him. But Jesus never asked anyone to commit suicide for him. So being in a relationship with a Darth Vader or abusive relationship where you say, I love you, but I can't be with you as the guy is pounding your face in, Jesus doesn't want it. Jesus wants you to get the heck out of there. But how you get out of there is the key, so that you're not increasing the Darth Vader out there.
The one,
Go ahead, Andy.
to follow up on your point, to try, it comes down to giving people hope. So even if you don't agree with anything this person does, potential Darth Vader, when you separate your ties with them, somehow leave it where you're giving that person hope. Because when that person's kicked out, it says, okay, everybody's shunning me, nobody loves me anymore.
I hate them. You become the Grinch.
So, but
Yeah.
you're told, I don't know, like, here, we can't help you, but go with God.
Yeah,
Or
go with
say
God.
something that the person can cling on to say, okay, I can't work with this community, but maybe I'll see something if I go with God.
Yeah. And I'm going to go back to
And that'll give them hope, and he won't come back and shoot you.
Right. Well, yeah. So that's helpful.
And
I might actually.
And I have an example of that. It's a country, Germany did everything wrong in World War I, and the whole rest of the world shunned them afterwards. They
Did more than shun Germany after World War I. They put reparations that were so harsh, it drove the country into economic disaster and laid the seeds.
And we planted the seed for another Darth Vader. Hitler
Yes, we did.
and he was welcome.
That's right.
So by giving them hope, then they won't come back.
Yep. And compare what the Allies did to Germany after World War I with what the Allies did in Japan.
Right. Oh, and then even what they did with Europe after World War
The Marshall Plan and everything like that. But I'm specifically thinking of Japan, where they came in and MacArthur was firm, but he was fair, and he earned the trust and the respect of the Japanese. And now they're one of our greatest allies.
With respect to Japan, since it was a personal friend who did it, Tom and Hallie Wright, Colonel Thomas Wright was sent in to Japan to rebuild, and Hallie Wright, his wife, was sent in to rebuild the educational system. They didn't just dump it. They started to support and rebuild the country. So.
That's right. Yep. Now, getting back to the Grinch, the movie, the Ron Howard movie, what it made me think of is, the little girl, Cindy Lou Who, everybody else sees the Grinch as gross, disgusting, evil, nothing to do with it. But she sees something in him, and so she keeps reaching out to him and at the very end of the movie, where the sleigh is going to go off the mountain, and he suddenly sees her up on the top, and he says, "What are you doing here?" And she says, "Nobody should be alone on Christmas," and that's his grace-filled, transformative moment. Okay, so I think that's what God calls us to be, what Jesus calls us to be, is those Cindy Lou Who's who, refuse to believe that anyone is totally evil, unacceptable. Yes, Don?
When Jesus had the disciples there and was sending them out, he described how they enter a town and if they're accepted in or if not. And his very terms in it is...
Shake the dust off your feet if they will not receive you. Yep. And, I don't see that as a vengeful thing. It's letting go so that the disciples can move on, so they're not carrying all of this emotional, baggage. And then, again, it all comes back to you. And if you get into the situation where you say, you know what, I can't continue with this relationship. And believe me, there are people out there who I call, the term I have is they're emotional black holes. They suck all the life out of you. So if you do get to that situation where you just say, I can't be in relationship with you anymore, it pains me to do that. What else do you have to do? Again, it comes all back to you.
You have to do anything.
Peter said, Lord, if my brother sins against me, how many times shall I forgive him? 7 times? Now, what Peter was doing was the rabbis said that you had to forgive someone 3 times. So Peter was doubling it and adding 1 for good measure. And Jesus says, no, not 7 times, but 70 times the 7.
Stop looking for the bad man out there.
Yep.
It's about me.
Yeah, it's about you. Yeah.
No, it's not about me. That's the one.
Well, no, it's
I'd rather have you forget it's about
it's
yourself. But
it's about you in the sense that you have to forgive. You have to.
You did this to me. You nasty.
Mhm.
You've got to take the responsibility. I'm the one calling the names.
Yep.
And I immediately a bell went off, and they said, "Well, you may come back with a gun and shoot you."
Yeah.
Open fire.
Well, yeah, that's
part of living on this planet is you've got to have security at the front door.
Mhm.
Once you come back with the firearm, the responsible thing may be to say, "Put that firearm down."
Mhm. Yep.
Yes, you can come back. Yes.
Yeah, but forgiveness really is all about you, but in a healthy
Yes,
way.
yeah.
And my favorite story about forgiveness is Corrie ten Boom, Dutch woman. Family got caught hiding Jews during World War II. They were all sent to the camps. And she said that a few years after the war was over, she was walking down the sidewalk in some city in the Netherlands, and she saw this guy walking toward her, and she immediately recognized him as a guard from the camp. And she said he had been particularly cruel. He recognized her, and she put her arms out, and she said, he put his arms out, and he said, "Forgive me." And her first reaction was this rage that seethed up in her. She wanted to, just assault him. And she said, "Lord, you have to help me here." And then she said she felt this wave of peace come over her, and she put her arms out, and she said, "I do forgive you." And they embraced. Looking back on that, she said at that moment, she realized that to forgive is to set the prisoner free and to realize that the prisoner was you. Yes, Don?
Put it in the phrase that we've used many times, when you're the individual in that position, like she was in, not my will, but thy will be done.
Yep. But again, I think we can summarize 2 things about this reading. One is Jesus is specifically talking about relationships within a community of faith, but it also applies to relationships in general. And it all comes down to you. You can't just keep pointing the finger and saying it's your fault, or, if you were smart enough, you'd realize that I'm right, or, oh, you're just too sensitive and all that. It's all about you. You go to the other person. You try to work things out, while at the same time understanding that, the other person might be right, you might be wrong. And that's what those witnesses will do. And sometimes, you have to say, I can't be in relationship with you, but you do it in a way that keeps the door open and makes grace front and center rather than anger and vengeance. Well, everyone, thank you. This was very helpful. Now I just got to go finish the sermon. Yeah.